What happens when a man who has spent years hiding from his past suddenly finds the echoes of his lost love and the children he never knew existed knocking at his door? Edward Montgomery, a wealthy loner, is about to face the consequences of a past he thought was buried forever. But fate has a way of rewriting history, and the truth has a habit of breaking down doors. Will he embrace the family he never knew, or will his broken past destroy any chance of redemption? Stay tuned, and don't forget to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Edward Montgomery sat alone in his massive mansion, the cold light of the moon streaming in through the tall windows. The mansion, perched high in the hills of Los Angeles, was an oasis of wealth and power, a monument to everything he had achieved. Yet, in the stillness of the night, it felt more like a tomb than a home. At tea, Edward had everything anyone could ever dream of: money, influence, and success. But none of it could fill the hollow void left by the death of his wife, Catherine, several years ago. The pain of losing her had never gone away. It lingered, twisting in his gut every time he walked through the empty halls of the mansion, every time he came face to face with the life he was now forced to live without her. His empire continued to grow, his business prospering as he had always dreamed. But it was meaningless. The only thing that mattered to him was the one thing he would never get back: the life he had lost with Catherine. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Another business call, another deal to finalize. He glanced at the screen, but he didn't bother picking it up. He was too tired, too exhausted from the constant cycle of work, meetings, and endless nights alone in this cavernous house. As he poured himself a glass of whiskey, the bitter liquid a small comfort, a knock came at the door. It was late. Too late for anyone to be visiting. Edward frowned, wondering if it was one of his staff, though he couldn't imagine why anyone would disturb him at this hour. He set the glass down and walked toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate. When he opened it, he was met by a sight that almost made his heart stop. Two boys, no older than 8 or 9, stood before him. Their faces were pale, their clothes ragged and torn. They looked cold, hungry and desperate. But what stopped Edward in his tracks was the striking resemblance they had to him. They were identical. For a moment, he simply stared at them, unsure of what to say. His breath caught in his throat and his heart began to race. It was impossible, but there they were, two boys who looked exactly like him. One of the boys, the older of the two, stepped forward, his voice small but firm. "Can we come in? We need help. Our mom, she's sick." Edward blinked, his mind racing. How could this be? How could these children look so much like him? Yet he had no memory of them, no knowledge of their existence. It was as though the universe had just thrown a terrible puzzle in his lap, one he couldn't begin to understand. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The boy hesitated for a moment before answering. We're your sons." The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. His mind reeled. Sons. But that was impossible. He'd never had children. He'd never even known about these boys. Before he could react, the younger boy clutched his brother's hand, looking up at Edward with wide, fearful eyes. "Please, mister, we don't know where else to go." Edward stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding. It was like a bad dream, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. These boys, his sons, had somehow ended up on his doorstep, alone and desperate. His first instinct was to shut the door, to walk away from the madness that was unfolding. But something inside him, something deep and primal, urged him to help them. Without saying another word, he stepped aside, allowing the two boys to enter the house. As they walked past him, Edward couldn't help but notice how they moved, how they clung to each other for comfort. It reminded him of his own childhood, though he had nothing but vague, fragmented memories of his parents. The silence that followed felt suffocating as Edward led the boys into the living room. They sat on the couch, still clutching each other's hands, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. Edward stood across from them, not knowing what to say. He had no answers, no understanding of what had just happened. His life, which had once seemed so carefully controlled, was now spinning out of his grasp. Minutes passed before Edward finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? You're my sons." The older boy, the one who had spoken earlier, glanced nervously at his brother before answering. "Our mom, she told us. She said you never knew. She said you didn't want us." Edward's stomach churned at the words. It was true. He had never known about them. He had never been given the chance to be a father, to know that he had children. The guilt hit him like a wave, crashing over him in an overwhelming rush. Before he could say anything else, there was another knock on the door. This time it wasn't the boys. It wasn't anyone from his staff. It was a woman. Edward froze as he opened the door. His heart skipped a beat when he saw her. Julia Evans, his ex-lover, the woman he had loved briefly but intensely, before everything had fallen apart. The woman who had once been the center of his world, until they'd gone their separate ways. "Edward," Julia said, her voice strained and fragile, "we need to talk." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of unspoken truths. Edward stood there, stunned. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change forever. The door had opened, and with it, the past Edward had tried to bury. As he stood there, facing Julia and the children, 1,000 questions raced through his mind. How had this happened? Why hadn't he known? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do now? There was no going back. The truth had found him, and with it, everything he had feared would one day come crashing down on him. Edward's hand lingered on the door, his mind reeling as he looked from Julia to the two boys sitting quietly in his living room. Julia's tired eyes met his, and for a moment it was as though time itself had stopped. The years melted away, and he could see her as he had once known her, bright, full of life, and holding a quiet strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. But that was a lifetime ago. The woman standing before him now was different, broken, worn by years of struggle. "Edward," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, "please, we need to talk." He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. As she crossed the threshold, Edward couldn't help but feel a pang of loss. He had loved her once, deeply, but they were no longer the same people. And that was painfully clear. Julia's gaze shifted to the boys. They were watching her carefully, but there was no recognition in their eyes, no sense of comfort in the way they clung to each other. She looked back at Edward, and for the first time, he saw the weight of years in her eyes. She had aged, much more than he had expected. "Why didn't you tell me?" Edward's voice cracked as he finally spoke. He couldn't stop himself from asking. The question was there, sitting like a stone in his chest, and it had to be said. Julia's eyes fluttered closed for a moment before she answered, her voice tight with bitterness. "Tell you what, Edward, that you had children. You were a part of my life for a few months where you never bothered to ask about me, about us. You disappeared, no calls, no letters. You left, and I never expected you to come back. And then when I found out I was pregnant, I had no choice but to carry on alone." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had no defense. He hadn't known, not about the pregnancy, not about the children. He had been wrapped up in his own life, in his grief, and when Julia had vanished, he had convinced himself she was just another fleeting chapter. But he had been wrong, so wrong. "What happened to you, Julia? Why didn't you reach out?" he asked, struggling to contain the wave of guilt threatening to drown him. "I didn't think you'd care," she said, her eyes narrowing with a mix of anger and sorrow. "You didn't care enough then, so why would you now?" Edward flinched. She wasn't wrong. The truth stung, and he could feel his entire world unraveling. He had been so focused on his own loss that he hadn't even realized the damage he had done to others. He had left her alone, and now here she was, standing in front of him, bringing with her a revelation that threatened to destroy everything he had built. Julia took a deep breath, her face softening as she spoke again. "I didn't know how to do it, Edward, raising them on my own. But I did. I gave them everything I had. And now," her voice broke, the vulnerability in her tone raw and real. "Now, I don't know how much longer I can keep fighting. I'm sick, Edward, and I don't have the strength to do this alone anymore." Edward felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his chest. She was sick. The woman who had once been the center of his world, the woman who had borne his children, was fighting a battle he hadn't known about. He could feel his throat tighten, his pulse racing. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about the present, about the family he never knew he had, and possibly losing them all over again. His gaze shifted to the boys. Michael and Matthew were sitting side by side, their eyes wide, their faces full of questions they didn't know how to ask. They had already been through so much, more than any child should ever have to endure, and now they were here, in his home, in his life, and he had no idea how to be a father to them. He didn't even know where to begin. Julia followed his gaze, and the sadness in her eyes deepened. They don't even know what it means to have a father. Edward, they've been raised without one, and I've tried to give them everything I could, but they need you. They need to know who you are. The words hit him hard. They were his sons. He had to be a part of their lives, had to find a way to give them what they needed. But how? How could he undo all the years of absence, all the pain they had been through without him? "What do I do, Julia?" he asked quietly. "How do I fix this?" She shook her head slowly. "You can't fix it. You can only start where we are right now. And right now, they need you more than anything. They need you to show up for them." Edward looked at her, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He didn't have the answers. He didn't even know where to begin. But for the first time in years, something inside him stirred. There was a flicker of hope, of possibility, a chance, perhaps, to make things right. But it wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this situation would be simple. He turned back to the boys. They were watching him closely, waiting for him to speak. His heart swelled with a mix of emotions, fear, guilt, uncertainty. But there was also something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He had a family. It wasn't the family he had imagined, the one he had dreamed of with Catherine, but it was his. And he had a chance to be a part of it, to make up for lost time. He just didn't know if it was possible. "Come here," he said softly, his voice unsteady. The words were clumsy, awkward, but they were all he could offer. The boys exchanged a glance, and slowly they stood. Edward reached out to them, his hand trembling. They came to him cautiously, still unsure of what to expect, but as they stepped into his arms, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. Julia watched the scene unfold, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. Edward had always been a man of control, a man who built walls around himself to keep the world out. But now, in the presence of his sons, the walls were beginning to crack. She had always hoped, deep down, that he would one day come around, that he would see them for what they were, his children, his blood. But even as Edward embraced them, Julia knew that this was only the beginning. There was so much more to face, so many questions that had yet to be answered, so many wounds that needed to be healed. And somewhere deep inside, Julia wondered if she could ever forgive him. Would Edward be the father they needed? Could he be the man she once loved again? Only time would tell. The weight of the moment lingered in the air long after the boys had reluctantly let go of Edward's embrace. They were still standing close to him, not fully certain of what to make of their newfound connection. He had wrapped his arms around them instinctively, as if trying to shield them from all the harm that had already been done. But that one gesture, one simple act of recognition, was not enough to undo the years of absence. Nor was it enough to erase the resentment that hung between him and Julia. She watched them, her arms folded tightly across her chest, the bitterness from years of struggle not yet leaving her face. Edward could feel her eyes on him, like a weight pressing down on his every movement. He glanced toward her, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her expression said it all. She was skeptical, guarded, as though she were still waiting for him to prove himself, to show that he could be the man she had once hoped he could be. "I'll take care of the boys," Edward finally said, his voice heavy with the promise of responsibility. "Whatever they need." Julia's eyes narrowed. "It's not that simple, Edward. They need more than just your money and your house. They need a father, They've never had one. His heart tightened at the harsh truth in her words. He had been living in a bubble of success and power, and had convinced himself that he could simply buy his way through life, fixing every problem with money or influence. But now, standing in front of Julia and seeing the two boys staring up at him like lost puppies, he understood that this, being a father, was something that couldn't be bought. Julia let out a sigh, as though she were tired of having this conversation, tired of carrying this burden on her own. She turned away and walked towards the small kitchen, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent house. "I should have never come here," she muttered, her voice tinged with both anger and exhaustion. "I should have just left you to your perfect little life, but you don't get to just walk in here and play hero now, not after everything." Edward stood frozen, his mouth dry. He knew she was right. There was no simple solution to what had happened. He couldn't just show up and expect them all to fall into place, but he also couldn't stand there and do nothing, not when he had a chance to make things right. He turned to the boys who were sitting on the couch, their eyes wide, waiting for something from him. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to approach them, but he could feel their need, their hunger for something more than just a roof over their heads. They wanted his love, his time, his commitment. Edward cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "Look, I know we're all in a strange place right now. I didn't know about you two. I didn't know what happened, and I can't change the past." The boys were silent, their eyes locked on him, unsure of what they were supposed to do. They were so much like him, shaped by their circumstances, but still innocent, still clinging to the hope that the man in front of them could give them the answers they needed. "But I'm here now," he continued, his voice more steady. "I'll figure this out, together. But you have to understand, it's going to take time. This isn't going to be easy." Michael, the older of the two, spoke up. "What do you mean, time?" His voice was quiet, but there was an edge of defiance in it. "We need help now. Our mom. She's getting worse." Edward's heart twisted at the mention of Julia's illness. He hadn't yet realized the severity of her condition, but now it hit him with full force. He had been so consumed with his own shock and confusion that he had ignored the most important thing in the room, Julia's health. "I know," he said, his throat tight. "I know, and we'll get you help. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Julia, who had been standing at the counter, turned around sharply. "You think it's that simple?" she snapped, her voice raw with frustration. "You think that throwing money at the problem will fix everything? You think you can just walk in and be some kind of savior?" Edward's face reddened. He knew he deserved her anger, but it still stung. He had never been good at this, at the personal stuff, at family. "I'm not trying to be a savior, Julia," he said, his voice low and serious. "I'm trying to be a father and a husband." Her expression softened just slightly, but the skepticism was still there. "You don't get to come in and fix things with just a few words and a check. You left us once, and now you want to just waltz in like you never disappeared? I'm not sure I can trust you, Edward." His breath hitched. The weight of her words crashed down on him again, harder this time. He had left, he had abandoned her, and now, standing in the wreckage of their past, he realized how much damage he had done. Julia was right. He hadn't just missed out on his children's lives, he had missed out on hers too. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. It felt like the only thing he could offer in the face of everything he had missed, everything he had destroyed. "I'm sorry for leaving, and I'm sorry for not being here for you, for all of you." Julia didn't respond at first. She simply stared at him, her arms still crossed tightly, her gaze fixed on the floor. When she finally looked up, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something close to hope, but guarded, hesitant. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Edward," she said softly, the words cutting through the silence. "But for them, I'll try. I just need to see that you mean it, that you're really here. Not just for the media, not just to fix your reputation." Edward nodded, though the weight of her accusation hung heavy between them. "I'm not doing this for anyone but you, for the boys. I don't care about my reputation anymore. I just want to make things right." There was a long silence as Julia regarded him carefully. Then she sighed. "Well, we'll see. But don't think this is going to be easy." As the tension in the room hung heavy, Edward couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose rise within him. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick, but he had no other choice. If he was going to rebuild any semblance of a family, it had to start now. The boys looked at him, still uncertain, but now with something else in their eyes. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was doubt, but it was a crack in the wall between them. Edward wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't walking away again. Not this time. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Edward's heart raced as he looked from Julia to the boys, unsure of what to do next. He had promised them all that he was here, that he would make things right, but he felt the enormity of the task before him, the weight of the years lost, the hurt that had been buried in both Julia and the boys' hearts. He couldn't just walk into their lives and expect everything to fall into place. Not after so long. Julia had already begun to distance herself, walking back to the kitchen with the same measured steps she had taken when she first arrived. Her demeanor was distant, cold, as though she couldn't allow herself to trust him again so easily. And who could blame her? He had disappeared from her life when she needed him the most. He had walked away from a future he didn't even know was waiting for him. He turned to the boys, who were sitting quietly, their hands clasped in their laps, their faces still uncertain. Michael, the older of the two, glanced up at him, his expression soft but wary. "I don't know what's supposed to happen now," Michael said, his voice small, barely above a whisper. You're our dad, right?" Edward swallowed hard. It felt like a cruel joke, the word dad rolling off the boy's tongue. Edward was supposed to be a father, his father, but he hadn't been there for any of it. He had missed everything: birthdays, first steps, first words. And now, here he was, standing in front of them, asking them to accept him as someone they had never known. "I am," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your father, and I'm sorry. I wasn't there before. I should have been." Michael didn't respond, his gaze focused on the floor. Matthew, the younger of the two, shifted in his seat, his small hands pulling at the hem of his shirt, his eyes downcast. Edward knew he had to do more. He had to make them feel safe. He had to show them, with actions, that he wasn't going anywhere. But how could he? The last time he had tried to form a connection with someone, it had ended in heartbreak and loss. How could he build something with these boys when all he had were apologies and regrets? "Do you want something to eat?" he asked, his voice suddenly sounding much too loud in the quiet of the room. "I could order something, or we could go somewhere. What do you want to do?" Neither boy answered. Their eyes were still focused on the ground. Edward's chest tightened as he realized how far he still had to go with them, how many walls he would need to break down before they trusted him. Julia returned to the living room, her face still tight, her arms crossed defensively. She looked at Edward with something that resembled contempt, but there was also a flicker of concern. "They're not hungry, Edward," she said flatly. "They've been through enough tonight. They need to process everything that's happened. So do I." Edward nodded, the reality of the situation hitting him harder than ever. He had expected some kind of warm reunion, some sign that everything would be okay, but it wasn't okay, not yet, not by a long shot, by a long... "We need to talk about what happens next," Julia continued, her voice sharp. "You can't just pretend that showing up here and throwing some money around will fix things. These boys need stability, they need love, and they need it from you. But you're not going to get there with half-hearted gestures and promises." The words stung, but they were true. Edward had been living in his own bubble, thinking that his wealth and success would make up for the emotional void he had created. But now he saw it. He saw the real need, the need to show up, to be present, to be a father, not just a provider. "I'm not pretending," he said, his voice low. "I know I have a lot to make up for. I'm not going anywhere, Julia. I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes." She stared at him, her eyes unreadable, before she sighed and turned to the boys. "They need more than your words, Edward. They need you to show them that you mean it. I'm not going to force them to accept you. I can't make them do that. But if you want to be part of their lives, you have to earn it, every day, and it won't be easy." Edward nodded again, swallowing the lump in his throat. He didn't have the answers. He didn't even know where to begin. But he knew that if there was a chance to rebuild this, it had to start now, with them, with Michael and Matthew, and with Julia, even though the gulf between them seemed insurmountable. He walked over to the boys, kneeling in front of them so he was at eye level. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked into their faces, their eyes still filled with uncertainty and fear. "Look, I know this is all a lot to take in," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I don't even know if I deserve that trust. But I want to try. I want to be here for you. I want to be your dad. And I'm going to work hard every day to show you that I'm serious." There was a long pause as the boys processed his words. Michael looked at him for a moment before slowly nodding, a small, hesitant movement. Matthew, the younger boy, seemed to study Edward with a quiet intensity before finally speaking up. "I don't know if I can trust you," Matthew said, his voice small, almost fragile. "But I guess we can try." Edward's heart swelled with something close to hope. It was a small step, but it was a step. He would take it. He would take whatever they gave him, and he would prove to them that he was worth the effort. Julia was watching the exchange carefully, her arms still folded across her chest, but her expression had softened ever so slightly. She didn't say anything, but Edward could feel the change in her, just a small shift, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. "Thank you," Edward said to the boys, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a chance." Michael didn't smile, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Trust, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. Julia stepped forward then, her eyes meeting Edward's. "This doesn't fix anything, Edward," she said softly, but there was no anger in her voice. "But it's a start, and that's more than I thought we'd get tonight." Edward nodded, feeling the weight of the long road ahead of him. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely lost. There was something to hold on to now, something that could, maybe, just maybe, lead him back to the family he never knew he had. As the boys sat beside him, their small forms still tense, but not as afraid, Edward finally allowed himself a breath of relief. It wouldn't be easy, but he would fight for them, for all of them. As the evening wore on, the air in the house felt a little less heavy. Edward knew the hard work had only just begun, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something stirring inside him, a sense of purpose, something worth fighting for. The morning came quickly, though it felt like the longest night Edward had ever endured. He had barely slept, too preoccupied with the events of the previous evening, too consumed by the overwhelming realization of what lay ahead. His mind raced with questions and doubts. How could he rebuild trust with the boys? How could he help Julia when she was so closed off, so filled with anger and disappointment? Was it even possible to repair what had been broken? He couldn't shake the image of Michael and Matthew, their faces a mixture of fear and hope as they looked up at him. They didn't know him, not really. They didn't understand the man he was now, and he couldn't expect them to. Trust was earned, not demanded, and the road ahead would be long and filled with difficult choices. Edward sat in the grand dining room of his mansion, the morning sunlight filtering through the windows, casting soft shadows across the polished wood table. Julia had already left for the day, presumably to visit the doctor. The boys had stayed with him. An awkward, tentative breakfast followed, filled with small talk and strained silences. They didn't speak much, and neither did he. But every now and then he caught a fleeting glance, a moment of vulnerability in their eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was then that Edward felt the full weight of what he had to face. He wasn't just dealing with Julia's illness. He wasn't just trying to forge a connection with his sons. He was also trying to untangle a web of lies and secrets that had been spun over the years, a web that, unbeknownst to him, had kept him from knowing the most important thing in his life. He had a family, he had children, and yet he had been kept in the dark about them, kept from the life he could have had. The phone on the table buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. He reached for it absently, not expecting anything important. But when he saw the name on the screen, his pulse quickened. It was Marcus, his longtime friend and business partner. Marcus had been with him through thick and thin, but something in the back of Edward's mind told him that Marcus might know more about the past than he had let on. He hesitated for a moment. He then answered the call. Edward, Marcus's voice came through, low and tense. I need to talk to you. It's about the boys. The mention of the boys caused a lump to form in Edward's throat. What about them? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I should have told you this sooner, Marcus said. His voice strained. But I didn't think it would matter. I didn't think it was necessary. I kept it to myself because, well, I thought it was for the best. Edward's stomach tightened. What are you talking about? What's going on? There was a long pause, and Edward could hear Marcus's heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, he spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. Edward, the truth is, I knew about the boys. I knew they were yours, and I kept it from you. The words hit Edward like a slap to the face. He stood up, pacing the room, his mind spinning. You knew? You knew and you didn't tell me? His voice cracked, the anger rising in him. Marcus's tone grew defensive. I didn't think it was the right time to bring it up. You were building your empire, and Julia, she was gone. It was complicated, Edward. I didn't want to ruin everything you had going. Edward stopped pacing, his mind reeling. You didn't want to ruin everything I had going. You think not telling me about my own children was somehow protecting me? Protecting me from what, Marcus? From being a father? He could feel his pulse quicken, the heat of betrayal burning in his chest. Marcus had known. He had known about his children, his flesh and blood, and he hadn't said a word. Why? Why had he kept that from him? Why didn't you tell me? Edward's voice was trembling now, a mix of hurt and fury. Why keep this from me? I thought you weren't ready, Marcus admitted, his voice quieter now, tinged with regret. You were still grieving Catherine, Edward. You weren't in the right place. I didn't want to throw something this big at you when you were already so broken. Edward was silent for a moment, the weight of Marcus's words settling over him. He could almost understand the reasoning. He had been broken. He had been lost in his grief. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the depth of Marcus's betrayal. He hadn't just kept a secret. He had kept Edward from the one thing that could have healed him, his family. I don't know what to say to you right now, Edward finally said, his voice cold. You should have told me. You should have let me decide what was best for me. For my children. There was another long pause on the line. And then Marcus spoke again, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. I'm sorry, Edward, I really am. But now the truth is out. You have the chance to be there for them. You can fix this. You can still be the father they need. Edward's heart sank. Could he fix this? Could he really make up for all the years he had lost? Could he truly be the father they deserved? He didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let his past mistakes define the rest of his life. He would fight for his family. He would fight for Michael, for Matthew, and for Julia, even if it meant facing the consequences of Marcus's betrayal. I'll figure it out, Edward said, his voice steady, though his heart was still racing. But don't ever hide something like that from me again. Understand? Understood, Marcus replied softly. I'll support you, Edward, whatever you need. Edward hung up the phone, his mind still spinning. He couldn't believe what he had just learned, how close he had been to the truth all along, yet had been kept in the dark. But now that he knew, now that the pieces were falling into place, he had no choice but to move forward. He had to take responsibility. He had to prove that he could be the father the boys needed. And no matter how difficult it was, he wasn't going to back down. He glanced out the window, his thoughts heavy with the weight of what was to come. He wasn't sure how he was going to rebuild his relationship with his sons, or how he was going to win Julia's trust. But one thing was certain. He wasn't walking away again. Not this time. The next chapter of his life was unfolding, and Edward Montgomery would face it head-on, no matter how messy, no matter how painful. As the day stretched on, the uncertainty weighed heavily on Edward's mind. He knew the next steps wouldn't be easy, but he was done being afraid. He was done being passive. If he was going to have a family, it was time to step up. The days following Marcus's revelation were a blur. Edward couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of betrayal that still lingered in his chest. He had spent the past few days in a haze, trying to navigate this new reality that had been thrust upon him. The news that Marcus had known about his sons, had kept it from him for all these years, was something Edward couldn't easily forget. It felt like the very foundation of everything he had built was suddenly unstable, as if the ground beneath him had cracked open and he was falling into an abyss he wasn't sure how to climb out of. His mind raced with questions. Why had Marcus done it? Had he truly thought he was protecting Edward by keeping the truth hidden? Or had Marcus seen it as a way to maintain control over the empire they had built together? No matter the reasoning, the fact remained that Marcus had kept the secret for far too long, and now Edward was left to pick up the pieces. But it wasn't just Marcus that Edward had to confront. He had to face the reality of his sons, Michael and Matthew. He had to make up for lost time, and that he knew would be a monumental task. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't know how to walk into their lives and erase the years of absence. But he had to try. As he sat in his office, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him, the door to the room opened, and Julia stepped inside. She looked worn, as if the weight of everything was bearing down on her. Her face was pale, and her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but there was something else in them now, something that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was a flicker of hope, or maybe it was just the quiet resignation of someone who had been through too much. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him. Edward could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He knew she was still angry with him. She had every right to be, but he also knew that they couldn't keep avoiding each other. They couldn't keep living in this fractured state. "Julia," he said quietly, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the window, staring out at the view. The city sprawled below them, the sun slowly sinking behind the hills, casting a soft orange glow over everything. It was beautiful, but Edward couldn't focus on it. His mind was too consumed with everything else. "I'm not sure what you want me to say, Edward," Julia finally said, her voice distant. "You've been absent for years, and now you want to swoop in and fix everything. I don't know if I can forgive you for that." Edward felt his stomach drop. He had expected this, but hearing the words out loud still stung. He had been absent, and now he was trying to walk back into their lives as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Julia was right. The hurt was deep, and it wouldn't disappear overnight. "I know I can't fix everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not leaving again. I'm not walking away from you or the boys. I want to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes." Julia's eyes flicked to him, and for the briefest moment he saw something soften in her gaze. She didn't speak, though, just turned her attention back to the city below. "You don't understand, Edward," she said quietly. "You can't just show up and expect everything to fall into place. It doesn't work that way. The boys, they've been through so much. They've lived through things no child should ever have to go through, and I've carried them through it alone. I don't know if I can trust you again." Edward swallowed hard. The weight of her words hitting him like a wave. He didn't know what to say. He couldn't blame her. How could she trust him after everything? After he had abandoned her? After he had left her to raise their children alone? To fight for them alone? "I'm not asking you to trust me overnight," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But I'm here. I'm willing to fight for them. I'm willing to fight for you, if you'll let me." Julia's expression remained unreadable as she stood by the window, but the silence between them seemed to stretch forever. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time, almost defeated. "I don't know if I can let you in, Edward," she said softly. "I don't know if I can ever let you in again." Edward felt his chest tighten, but he didn't let the hurt show. He had already hurt her so much. The last thing he could afford now was to push her further away. "I'll wait," he said simply. "As long as it takes." She didn't answer. Instead, she walked over to the door, her footsteps slow and heavy. Before she left, she turned to him one last time, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than he expected. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly, "but I will try, for the boys." Edward nodded, feeling a small sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't much. It wasn't the forgiveness he had hoped for, but it was something. He would take it, He would take whatever she was willing to give, and he would prove himself. As she left the room, Edward sat back in his chair, his mind racing. There was so much to do, so many mistakes to atone for. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose again. He wasn't just fighting for his business or his empire, he was fighting for his family. He had no idea what the future held, but he was determined to find out. He was going to be the father his sons deserved, and he would find a way to make things right with Julia if she would let him. The following days were filled with tension, but also small victories. Edward began spending more time with Michael and Matthew. It wasn't easy. They were wary of him, unsure of how to accept him into their lives after so many years of silence. But Edward didn't back down. He took them out for simple things, walks in the park, trips to the local ice cream shop, moments where they could talk, even if the conversation was sparse. Each moment was an attempt to break through the walls they had built around themselves, a slow and fragile attempt to forge a bond that had been lost. But the hardest part was Julia. Though she allowed Edward to spend time with the boys, she remained distant, her walls still firmly in place. He could see the pain in her eyes whenever their paths crossed, the depth of the hurt she carried with her. But she never told him to leave. She never asked him to stop trying. And that, he realized, was progress. He wasn't giving up, not now. Not ever. He would do whatever it took to prove to them all that he was here to stay. The weight of the situation hadn't lifted. If anything, it had only grown heavier. Edward sat in the study, his gaze locked on the paperwork in front of him. But his mind was 1,000 miles away. The company was still teetering on the edge of chaos, its foundation cracking under the pressure of the scandal that had erupted when the media got hold of the story of his children. It seemed like the world had turned its focus on him, on his past mistakes, his secrets, and the relentless headlines were only making it worse. But his business, though important, wasn't the only thing pulling at him. It was the constant pressure to be a father to Michael and Matthew. Every time he looked at them, he was reminded of the years he had missed, the moments that couldn't be undone. They were still so unsure of him, their eyes filled with confusion, anger, and an aching desire for a father who had been absent for far too long. The small steps forward felt like they would take a lifetime to build. Still, Edward couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up, his heart skipping a beat. It was Julia. She had been more distant than ever in the past few days, her coldness a stark reminder of the trust he had to rebuild. She stood in the doorway, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression guarded. "You need to talk to the boys," she said flatly, not bothering with pleasantries. Edward's stomach tightened. "What happened? Is everything okay?" "They're fine," she said, her voice softer than it had been in days. "But you need to be honest with them. You can't keep pretending that everything's fine when they know it isn't. You need to tell them the truth about your past, about why you weren't there." The words struck Edward harder than he expected. He had known this conversation was coming. He had known that eventually he would have to come clean about everything. But hearing Julia say it, hearing the weight of her disappointment in her voice, made it all feel too real. "I know," Edward said, his voice steady but heavy with regret. "I'm just trying to find the right way to say it. I don't want to hurt them more than I already have." Julia stepped into the room, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of frustration and something else. A trace of empathy, maybe, or perhaps it was just exhaustion. She had been carrying this weight for so long, and now, despite everything, she was still trying to make this work. "Edward," she said, her voice softer now, "the truth won't hurt them more than what they've already been through. They need to understand why you weren't there, why you weren't part of their lives. They need to hear it from you." He felt the sting of her words deep in his chest. He had been running from the truth for so long, hiding from his own failure. He had built walls around himself to protect his fragile heart, but in doing so, he had built barriers between him and the people who mattered most. He looked at Julia, his throat tight. "You're right. I should have done this a long time ago. I should have been there for them. But I wasn't, and I can't change that." Julia's face softened, and for a brief moment, he saw the woman he had once known, the woman who had trusted him, loved him, before everything had gone wrong. "You can't change the past, Edward," she said gently, "but you can change the future, for them, for us, but only if you're honest." He swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. This was it. This was the moment that could make or break everything. He could no longer hide behind apologies or empty promises. He had to face the truth, no matter how difficult it was. "I'll talk to them," Edward said, his voice resolute. "Thank you, Julia." She didn't respond right away, just nodded once, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Edward to face the hardest conversation of his life. That evening, as the last remnants of daylight faded into darkness, Edward sat down with Michael and Matthew in the living room. The boys were both sitting on the couch, their bodies stiff, their faces unreadable. Edward felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. He had never felt more vulnerable, more unsure of himself. How could he explain to them why he had abandoned them? How could he make them understand the years of regret that had haunted him, the mistakes he had made, the choices he had avoided? "Boys," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you, something that you both deserve to know, about me, about why I wasn't in your lives." Michael's eyes flicked up to him, his expression wary. Matthew didn't look at him at all, his gaze fixed on his hands, clenched tightly in his lap. Edward could feel the distance between them, the invisible wall that had been built over the years. "I didn't know about you," Edward continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know you existed until recently. I know that's hard to understand, but I wasn't there for you, and that's the truth. I made mistakes, and I wasn't there when you needed me, and I will never be able to change that." Michael's gaze didn't waver, but Edward could see the hurt in his eyes. "Why didn't you try to find us?" Michael asked quietly, his voice small, but his words cutting through the silence like a knife. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the question pressing down on him. How could he explain the shame, the fear, the overwhelming sense of being unworthy of fatherhood? How could he explain the guilt that had kept him frozen for so long? "I didn't know how to," Edward admitted, his voice breaking. "I was scared. I didn't feel like I had the right to be part of your lives. I didn't think you would want me, and I was wrong. I should have fought for you, for both of you." Michael didn't speak for a moment, but Matthew finally looked up at him, his face still guarded, but there was something different in his eyes. Maybe it was the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe it was just the beginning of a shift, a crack in the walls that had kept them apart for so long. "You're here now," Matthew said softly, his voice barely a whisper. Edward nodded, his chest tightening. "I'm here now, and I'll do everything I can to make it right. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to be part of your lives. I want to be your dad, and I will never leave again." For a moment, the room was quiet. The tension hung in the air, but there was a shift, a subtle one, but it was there. Michael and Matthew exchanged a glance, the unspoken communication passing between them, as if they were deciding what to do with the truth Edward had just shared. Finally, Michael spoke again. "We'll see," he said quietly, "but maybe we can try." Edward felt a wave of relief flood through him, though he knew it wasn't over. They weren't there yet, not by a long shot, but this was a start, a chance, and for the first time in years, he felt like he had something to fight for. "Thank you," he whispered, barely able to find the words. "Thank you for giving me a chance." Matthew looked at him, his eyes softening. "I guess it's a start." Edward smiled, a real, genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was a beginning, and that was all he needed. As they sat together, Edward realized that this was just the first of many steps. The road ahead would be hard, and there would be more moments of doubt, more moments of pain. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the future. He was ready to face it, and he was ready to do it with his family, no matter how long it took. The days after Edward's conversation with Michael and Matthew were filled with small but significant changes. The silence between them, though still heavy, had started to crack. It was as if the very air in the house had shifted, and Edward found himself more present, more engaged than he had ever been before. Every day he tried harder. Every moment he spent with his sons, every small effort to connect, was one more step toward what he hoped would be a real, lasting bond. Julia, too, seemed to be softening, though it was subtle. She was still distant, still wary. But there were moments, fleeting but real, when her eyes would linger on him, and the hardness in her gaze would fade just enough for him to see a flicker of something else. Hope, maybe. Or perhaps it was simply the exhaustion of years of fighting alone. Whatever it was, Edward held onto it, clinging to the fragile thread of possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild everything that had been broken. But even with the small steps forward, the road ahead still seemed impossibly long. The media had continued to hound him, the headlines relentless. His business was in jeopardy, his personal life under constant scrutiny. But amidst the chaos, there was something that kept him going, something that made it all feel worth it. His family, his sons, Julia, even if she wasn't quite ready to forgive him yet. One morning, about a week after their first real conversation, Edward was sitting at the breakfast table, a cup of coffee in hand, when Michael and Matthew entered the room. The older boy, Michael, hesitated before sitting down, his usual guarded expression softening just slightly as he looked at his father. Matthew, ever the quieter one, followed Michael into the room and sat beside him, still unsure but not completely withdrawn. Edward smiled at them, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace settle in his chest. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but they were here. They were trying. "How do you sleep?" Edward asked gently, trying to break the tension that still hung between them. "Okay," Michael answered, his voice still a little hesitant, but at least he was speaking. That, in itself, was progress. "You?" "Same," Edward replied with a small chuckle. "I haven't had a good night's sleep in a while. Too much on my mind." Matthew looked up at him, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What do you think about all this?" he asked quietly. "You know, us, being here, with you." The question hit Edward hard. He had been so focused on earning their trust, so focused on showing them he was here to stay, that he hadn't truly thought about how they felt, what they were going through. They had been thrust into a world they didn't understand, a world they hadn't asked for, and now they were forced to adjust to a father they barely knew and a life that was nothing like the one they had imagined. "I think," Edward paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to be honest in a way he hadn't been before. "I think it's going to take time. I think we're all figuring things out. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere, and I want to help you two feel like you belong here, like you have a place." Michael didn't respond immediately. He picked at the food on his plate, clearly deep in thought, but Matthew's eyes softened just a little, and he spoke up, his voice quiet but sincere. "We don't really know how to have a dad," he said, the words coming out in a way that made Edward's heart ache. "But we're trying, and we'll see if we can figure it out with you." Edward's chest tightened, but he nodded, his throat thick with emotion. "I'll try too, Matthew. I'll try to be the dad you need." The moment hung between them, heavy but filled with the possibility of something real. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was progress, and in a way, it was enough. Julia entered the room just then, her steps measured but not as stiff as before. She nodded at Edward, acknowledging his presence without a word, but her eyes softened when she saw the boys. It was brief, a flash of something fleeting, but it was there. She still wasn't ready to trust him fully, but maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe that he could change, that he could be the man they all needed him to be. "Good morning," she said, sitting down at the table, her eyes flicking briefly to Edward before returning to her sons. "How are you two doing?" "We're okay," Michael said, his voice a little more open now. "I think we're all still trying to figure it out." Julia nodded, her lips pressing together in a thin line. But there was no bitterness in her expression, no anger, just quiet acceptance. "It'll take time," she said softly, glancing at Edward, "for all of us." Edward swallowed hard, his mind racing with everything that still needed to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel lost. There was a chance here, a real chance to make things right. Later that day, after breakfast, Edward took the boys out to the park. It was a small, simple thing, just a few hours spent playing basketball, throwing a football around, and talking about nothing in particular. But it was enough. Enough to see Michael smile, enough to hear Matthew laugh, enough to feel like he was finally becoming the father he had never known how to be. They didn't speak much about the past. They didn't need to. They were making new memories, and that was what mattered now. In that moment, Edward realized that this was how they would build their future, slowly, carefully, one step at a time. When they returned home later that afternoon, the house seemed quieter than usual. Julia was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and for a brief moment, Edward allowed himself to simply watch her. It wasn't lost on him how much she had done, how much she had sacrificed. She had raised their children alone, had given them everything she could, and though they were still so far from healing, he could see in her that there was something there, something that could still be repaired. "I'm sorry," Edward said to her quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "I'm sorry for everything I did to you. I don't know how to make it up to you, but I'll try. I'll do whatever it takes to show you I'm serious." Julia turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in the quietest of voices, she spoke. "I know you're trying, Edward, and I appreciate that, but it's going to take time. It's going to take more than just words." Edward nodded, understanding the depth of what she was saying. He had no illusions about the journey ahead. He had a long road to travel with Julia, a road filled with the weight of their past and the uncertainty of their future. But in that moment he knew one thing. He wasn't walking that road alone anymore. The family he had once lost was still standing here, with him, waiting for him to show up. And this time, he wouldn't let them down. As the sun set and the house grew quiet, Edward found himself sitting with Michael and Matthew again, the three of them watching a movie together. The air was calm, and for the first time in a long time, Edward felt a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this. They were together. They were trying, and that, in itself, was everything. For the first time in years, Edward Montgomery felt like he was home.